Let's talk fantasy. The other side of football analysis here. Something that is equally interesting, but a whole lot different. A lot different type of puzzle we're looking at here. But NFC West, yeah, I'm not going to waste too much time. I pride myself in being able to know what I'm doing in fantasy football as well as regular for the sports betting. So just in general, before each of these divisions, so that's what I'm going to do today, right? I'm going to go through each team and talk about what they have on their rosters as far as fantasy production goes and what you should be looking at in your drafts. But I think it's important to remind people of things in general. At least these are my strategies, but they work and they work for really good reasons, right? So the first one, don't draft a tight end or a quarterback unless you're getting something crazy. So right, if you're in the 10th round of your draft and Patrick Mahomes is there, I'm never going to tell you to not draft him because he's a quarterback. That's not the point of this. The point is that with these single starter positions, as is very well documented at this point, there are going to be a whole lot of players that put up starter-worthy weeks, and not a lot of them are going to be doing it consistently, right? It's different. It looks different, tight end. It's just that almost no one's good, and quarterback, it's that almost everyone's good. Now, your individual scoring format can change that type of thing, but in general, you're just better off stockpiling as many running backs and wide receivers as you possibly can, because that's how you win in fantasy, and specifically running backs. For the same reason, it's just the scarcity thing. Not breaking ground here, but there's only going to be, a few really, really valuable running backs in the NFL, especially ones that are consistently valuable. Whereas with receivers, it's a shit show. People are jumping to the top of boards every week. And again, with the tight ends quarterback thing. Remember with the draft too, you're not done with your team, or at least if you're trying to be good at fantasy football, you're not done with your team whenever you finish the draft. You're just trying to get as much value as you possibly can. I think that's important to remember, because when you make trades, when you're looking at, what you can cut, add, drop later, that type of thing, you just want to have as good of a foundation to start with as you possibly can. And that's how you can make trades later into the season and still stay really good or really relevant. So yeah, in the draft, just you're trying to get as many good players as you possibly can. Opportunities king. I could think of players as good as I want them to be, but they're not getting targets from their offense for whatever reason. you can't really help them in fantasy. And target things that you can know in week one, because there are things, right, with a lot of rookies especially, you never know how they're going to get worked into an offense, and a lot of times it's not by mid-season, at which point generally your fantasy season is not determined, but you're going to be real high or real low at that point in a lot of ways. And what you want to know, if you're trying to, again, be good, are things that immediately. So if, take a veteran wide receiver, is he going to start? Is he going to not? Well, you're going to see that really quickly. And obviously that's going to change throughout the season. That type of information you can actually, take action with, as opposed to having to sit and wait and waste your roster spots. But let's go through the NFC West. And what are we looking at here? So the Arizona Cardinals first. This is their offensive depth chart. So, it's important. I'm still going to be talking about how this offense is going to function and look as a real thing, and then we could talk about how that affects the fantasy value of each of these players. So you're talking about an offense, right, with the Cardinals that last year super productive, especially yardage wise. They kind of fell off a bit of a cliff points wise towards the end of the year, which is a concern. That's not something that I'm going to just chalk up to variability, given who their head coach is, but tons and tons of fantasy value to be had here. I mean, Kylie Murray himself, obviously, right, he's very good. He's getting better, and he is in the unique situation this year of being able to occupy maybe his best self. Mostly because they trade for Rodney Hudson, new starting center. So you go from, and I talked about this in the Cardinals preview of the team, you go from the worst, weakest, or one of the worst and weakest starting centers in the NFL, who's getting shoved 10, 15 yards, it feels like, back every play, to one, maybe the best pass protector that we have available in the modern NFL at center position. And it's going to make a really big difference, because Kyler Murray has shown consistently, while he's going to make a lot of mistakes as far as reading defenses, he's going to do some stupid things. He's not necessarily going to be a killer from a clean pocket. When he gets a clean pocket, he's going to chuck the ball deep, and he's going to be really good at it. And when you're talking about fantasy value, I generally, as far as like actual efficiency and like who's going to win a game, I don't like a lot of statistics. But for fantasy stuff, I mean, there's a lot more data as opposed to how they can help you. And with that, average yards in the air is one of these types of things where the farther down the field, the guy throws the ball, the more yards you can get, and the more likely it's going to be a touchdown. That's simple stuff, but that really, really matters here because you're looking at a situation, like I said, where Kylie Murray is going to have a pocket to step into and to kind of free himself to throw all this crazy shit downfield, which really helps them in general because, the less they have to lean on Cliff Kingsbury and his garbage offense to help themselves, the better they're going to be, right? And what do I mean by that? So Cliff Kingsbury, right, he's in this vein of coaches, technically, of same guys in these divisions like Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan, that type of thing, where they're taking these college, modern, spread offenses and applying the concepts to the NFL. Cliff Kingsbury does it bad, as opposed to the other guys we'll talk about later, and that he seems to think that throwing 10 wide receiver screens and a reverse in a row is smart modern play calling. Well, it's not. It's just different than what was happening before, whatever. I'm not going to get super, super, super into that, but that's still an issue this offense is going to face. However, so we talked about Kyler Murray, right? And he's going to be super valuable. I'm not worried about that. I think right now he's basically like the quarterback 3 in draft, something like that, and he's maybe not worth it, with the whole positional thing, depending on your scoring format, but he's going to be super productive. But the more interesting guys to talk about, obviously, are the skill positions. That's what really wins. So let's start running back. Chase Edmonds, James Conner, 2 guys who are looking at probably a fairly even split in carries, and neither of whom I think have a particularly good shot at being a great fantasy running back this year. Why? Well, this team's still going to suck at running the ball. Their stats are going to look better because of what Kyler does on the ground. But as far as like what the running backs do, I do understand that Kenyon Drake a couple years ago had a second half of the season after he got traded here that was very good. And there's not much to argue with that, but that was a pretty unique set of circumstances as well as a really soft schedule that they ended up playing that led to that. When you look at this team now, this team runs a bunch of bad draw plays and a bunch of soft interior shit that gets kind of swatted at the line of scrimmage. That's still the case, especially given the status of their interior offensive line. So how are Chase Edmonds and James Conner going to be successful? It has to be through pass catching, and that means that Chase Edmonds really is the valuable one here. He has shown at times when given opportunities, he can get into the end zone at least. He has a couple notable fantasy games in his career. Overall guy, he's a pretty good player who's going to get an okay opportunity on a probably pretty good offense, which is not a bad thing. James Conner, I mentioned this run scheme, and it's almost identical, really, funny enough, to the one he comes from in the Steelers. And he's shown that he can be a valuable player in that. Now, I don't like him in this offense particularly. Again, this is even a more finesse version of what the Steelers do. And while he's going to have valuable moments for sure, definitely going to be the goal line back with some touchdowns there. As far as a week-to-week fantasy value, he's going to be super dependent on scoring touchdowns, and that's not really something you're banking on. Wide receiver-wise, so D-Hop at the top, obviously super good. I'm not going to get into my whole thing with him not being the best receiver in the NFL right now, because whatever. But really good. Fantasy-wise, though, while he's still great and in the top, 5 for receivers, I will warn to be careful with him as far as expecting him to be like any better than he was last year in this offense. The reason being, Kyler Murray and Cliff Kingsbury have shown that they don't hyper target one player. They really do commit to the whole, throw to whoever's open or throw this play the way that the play is designed, as opposed to because, our best receiver is running the play in this way, which may not make a ton of sense on the surface, but that's what keeps DeAndre Hopkins from getting the 160 or whatever targets that the other number 1 receivers around the NFL got last year. And that's going to be something that's going to continue, I can pretty much guarantee. So while it'll still be super useful, it has a chance at a lot more touchdowns this year, given the probable improvement of their offense in that area. Still not somebody that you're looking at the very, very, very top, because I will tell you again, he's just not going to hit that level of targets because of the way this offense runs. Other than him, is there draftable, usable players in this wide receiver room? I don't really think so. AJ Green, he's, he was released from the Bengals or the Bengals let him walk for a reason. He just doesn't really have any more. While he will still be valuable on third downs, he's still a smart guy. I've talked about with the Cardinals before. I don't hate him as a starter. He's going to be a guy fantasy wise who is going to have to score touchdowns. And while he's still probably okay with that, is there any reason to believe he's better about that than a lot of other guys across the league? No. So he's kind of whatever. Christian Kirk is just a bad player. And while he will have games where he's going to catch long touchdowns, I can guarantee you, because how fast he was and how this offense works, that's as far as a predictability thing, which is what you need in fantasy. Like, you're just going to have no shot really with that, especially because now he's sharing that position with Andy Isabella, who's in essence the same player, but a little bit better. I will mention at the bottom here, Rondale Moore. So Rondale Moore is a player who I'm pretty interested in for the Cardinals, because he's going to be playing – well, he's played a lot in this preseason, right? And it looks like he's actually going to get some run in their offense. And while it's not a guarantee and he is a rookie, he has a chance to be the recipient of all those dumbass receiver screens that they throw over and over again. And while I don't think his ceiling is particularly high, because he's going to be trapped by the things that's getting him targets, right? Because they just don't do good enough for him to go crazy. You could be looking at quite a few receptions, and theoretically, he looks talented enough to turn that into, actual number production. So while he's not a player that's worth drafting at this moment, if he's one of these guys where if he comes out week one, gets eight receptions from the slot, he could be a really important guy to be looking at early in the season. And then tight end Max Williams is impossible to play for fantasy. This is the average draft position for all these players, what we've been talking about. So, as you can see, Kylie Murray, that's not the type of quarterback I'm ever looking to draft, as I mentioned, because at that point you're still talking about very, very good wide receivers and running backs that your roster a lot of times really needs to actually be good. And the difference in his production versus, his production like an undrafted quarterback versus a running back in the early fourth round and an undrafted running back is so wildly disparate that it's hard to justify drafting Kyler. Now, if he drops a little bit, I do think he could live up to their production and stuff like that. But other than him, Edmonds and Connor, that's another tough one where there's so many good receivers at that point that you really want to have your running backs out of the way so you're not forced into taking a guess at the Edmonds Connor situation. And while there is some value there, I actually don't think the ceiling of either of those guys is particularly high. At receiver, I'm not touching Moore or Green in a draft, probably. Maybe Rondale Moore in the last round. But Hop, I'd be careful as far as wide receiver 4 is a little high because, like I said, he's just not going to get fed the targets the way some other top receivers are. But, it's whatever. He's definitely going to be productive. And when you look at their schedule real quick, it's not super easy, which is going to be a theme of these NFC West teams that while a lot of people say this is going to be like the best division of football and stuff like that, I don't know about that one. Because not only do I not think they're all quite as talented as they're made out to be, they play a lot of really good teams, which is going to be a theme again here. So let's move to the next team, San Francisco 49ers. And this is the offense we're looking at here. And you know what? I have a ton of problems with Jimmy Garoppolo at quarterback, but it's been literally proven with Shanahan, if Jimmy Garoppolo is your quarterback, then you can have a super, super productive offense, especially if you start with a super strong O-line, which is generally the case here. Now, they're not crazy elite, but, with Trent Williams, Lincoln Tomlinson, Mike McGlinchey, you have this crazy foundation at the front. And with a team that's going to run the ball so much and run it so positively, there's potentially a lot of value on this team. So, how are they going to work? You're still, if Jimmy Garoppolo is a starter, you're still looking at a team that's dependent on how good or bad the opposing middle linebacker is, or linebackers are, for how effective you're going to be through the passing game. But if you're not getting killed there, they're going to be really, really good on the ground. They're going to do a bunch of really smart stuff to get guys the ball. And while I'd be worried about the ceiling with Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk because of Jimmy Garoppolo, they're both going to be so integrated in this offense and so consistently used that you're looking at real value there. And then George Kittle, he's amazing. As far as I'm concerned, he's the best tight end in the NFL. And while fantasy-wise, that's not the case because of Travis Kelce, he's not that far behind as far as I'm concerned for being number 2 because, again, with Garoppolo healthy, he loves throwing to George Kittle. Loves throwing to George Kittle. And George Kittle is good enough to be consistently open in an offense that's going to give him a bunch of really good opportunities and chances to score touchdowns. At running back here, so you see that depth chart. Really, the only guys that you care about for this purpose are the top 2, Mostert and Sermon. And I'm going to tell you, don't forget that this 49ers running back position is really, really valuable. We've seen in, years past, Jeff Wilson last year was a worthy starter at times, despite being a pretty exceedingly mediocre running back. Jermichael Hasty had games that were useful, going back to the times like Matt Breida, Raheem Mostert's breakout year. Like, this is super valuable, and I don't want people to forget that because when you look at the draft positions for these guys, I understand there's 2 of them, but like they supported kind of 2 running backs before too. They were also, through Tevin Coleman out there was getting some fantasy production, and it's not ideal. I understand, why they're not at the top there, but especially early in the year when you're probably not looking at Trey Sermon as a rookie coming in taking a bunch of carries, I think there's a lot of value in Raheem Mostert because he's going to be the starting running back on a team that runs the ball really well and a lot, right? And I hope people don't forget that because while I can't guarantee it's going to last in the season, there's a real chance it does because Raheem Mostert is not a scrub. He's a legitimately talented player who knows what's happening in this offense, is going to consistently execute it very, very well. So there's that. Like I said, Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, 2 guys I'm huge fans of player-wise. This offense limits their ceiling quite a bit because of how much they don't throw the ball or throw the ball down the field. But they can still be both very useful, and they've shown to be productive fantasy-wise as well. And I talked about George Kittle. The one thing I'll kind of mention before I move on here is with Trey Lance. So Trey Lance scares me, actually, for the skill position guys here. While he has a really high ceiling, I guess theoretically, for what this offense could be, as a rookie, that's really unlikely. And if he comes in, there's a big chance he ends up hurting the guys who are traditionally valuable in this offense. Now, what I will say is there's a big chance he changes things as well as far as the focus of the offense. I think it's important for me to explain that more, right? Because how do you get like league winners and stuff like that in fantasy football? So obviously there's injuries, but also I think there's the route of like an offense that because of a coordinator change or because of a quarterback change or because of a scheme shift in focus or whatever, goes from a player who projected, wasn't going to be that valuable, wasn't going to be that good to somebody who's constantly getting, shelled with opportunity. And if Trey Lance comes in for this team, there's a real chance that happens because Jimmy Garoppolo, if he's starting, he's just going to throw the ball to George Kittle 15 times a game, basically, right? But with Trey Lance, if he does all the things that Jimmy Garoppolo doesn't do as far as a guy who's actually reading the field and looking outside the numbers, you could be talking about a ton of value for Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel because those guys are going to be the ones occupying those areas. And while it's not a guarantee or anything like that, I will just mention that with especially Ayuk because Deebo Samuel's just hurt even right now. You could be talking about a guy who finishes way, way higher than like the wide receiver 22 5th-round pick that he's going right now because he could be the guy who steps into this, number 1 offense role if Trey Lance ends up coming in and changes the priorities of what Shanahan is looking to do. So I will mention that. Now, unfortunately, their schedule is not exactly ideal. You do catch, because as I mentioned before, with Garoppolo starting, you basically only care about how good not only, but basically care about how good or bad the opposing linebackers are because that determines so much how effective they're going to be. And while you do catch the Eagles in week 2 who are really bad there, you have some other issues as far as, you look at the Colts, Bears, Seahawks, stuff like that. Even Lions, Jamie Collins, week 1 isn't too bad. So it's not ideal. It's not the worst thing in the world, but that's a look at their schedule. So then we go to the Los Angeles Rams. So this is another team where you're talking about a wildly large variance, and you can have some real value because of that. Now, it can also hurt you, of course, but with the difference, the change from Jared Goff to Matthew Stafford at quarterback this year, that's just one of those things where the guy is so different than the guy that was before him that it's hard to really translate one-to-one how the offense is going to work. In fact, I would argue it's impossible because Matthew Stafford just doesn't play quarterback the way that Jared Goff does at all. He's infinitely better at it, but it's just not going to look the same. And when that happens, you never know who's really going to, be the one to step into the targets and step into the production in that situation. Now, I will say there's some guys I'm assuming it's going to be, which we'll get to, but yeah, so you talk about Matthew Stafford. That's the big change. As far as Matthew Stafford as a fantasy quarterback, too risky and unnecessary. I don't think there's a reason to draft him because of that variability and how productive he's going to be specifically. Like I said, I can't imagine he's not going to be good and efficient, but that doesn't equal fantasy production necessarily. But besides him, what are we looking at for the other positions? So first one, running back. Daryl Henderson, right? So Cam Akers, the projected starter, rookie breakout-ish player for the Rams last year. Obviously, he tore his Achilles near the beginning of training camp. So, as of right now, name-wise, the only real relevant guy is Daryl Henderson, a player who a lot of people are excited about out of Memphis, who I actually think is quite a good player and would be exceedingly productive if he was to be given a full-time role. However, that full-time role is nowhere near guaranteed. I mean, this is a team that started Malcolm Brown last year over both Akers and Daryl Henderson. Now, Malcolm Brown is a little bit underrated himself, but he's like potentially a third stringer on the Dolphins this year for a reason. Like, they didn't trust Daryl Henderson even in that scenario. And even towards the end of the year, after Malcolm Brown was out, again, they still opted to play Cam Akers a lot, a guy who I'm particularly not impressed with. So that is a little bit concerning. And again, while he'd be very productive in this offense, it's not like he's this, every down super talented guy who's going to get a ton of carries or receptions. And so I don't know that the ceiling is quite as high as people make it out to be because I just can't imagine the Rams trust him with a full-time role. I think it's basically impossible. But because of that, there's a lot of value in his backup, Xavier Jones, a guy who has been pretty good in preseason. And, he's effectively a lottery ticket. There's a lot of worlds where he ends up basically splitting carries with Daryl Henderson this year, because of how the Rams give out running back opportunities and the fact that they're definitely not committed to Henderson at the top. And Xavier Jones is showing to be a pretty talented guy. And frankly, in this scheme, it's not like you need to be that good to be productive. So that's something I will mention that's, I think, really important when you look at running backs, is that the more you look at it, Xavier Jones kind of looks better and better just as a chance. Again, with the draft, if he sucks or doesn't play week 1 or whatever, then you can cut him right away. That's the type of thing you're looking for. But there's a real chance that he's like on the field a lot as soon as week 1. At receiver, Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, top 2 there. So these are the main guys that relate to my point with Matthew Stafford and how he kind of creates a lot of potential change in the offensive production here, because Jared Goff, just while he was very talented physically at throwing the ball down the field, mentally was very much not. Matthew Stafford is both of those things. He's very talented mentally and physically as far as throwing the ball down the field. And that makes me really excited for the prospects of Robert Woods specifically. Robert Woods is an elite receiver, very, very clearly the best receiver on this team. And I think there's a real chance that Matthew Stafford almost guarantee it, that Matthew Stafford is going to identify that and end up feeding a lot of targets to Robert Woods up and down the field because Robert Woods is open. Now, he also fits into the offense very well. He's going to be used as like a running, or not a running back, but as a runner of the football at times. He's going to get screens thrown to him, that type of stuff that, boosts his floor as a receiver. But I think there's a real chance Robert Woods shoots right back up to the top of the wide receiver rankings this year because dude's just really good, and he's playing with a really good quarterback now. Cooper Kupp, too, I'm not as excited at Cooper Kupp or his ceiling or anything like that, but he's shown very clearly fantasy-wise he's going to be productive every time he's on the field, which will include this year. And especially with a better quarterback, you could be talking about a lot more touchdowns. And generally with how the touchdowns work on this team, he's going to help with that. He's still going to have, again, that floor of catching screens, of doing stuff like that. So I'm excited for him. I will mention their ancillary guys. You're never drafting Deshaun Jackson or Van Jefferson, but Deshaun Jackson especially is another because he's so good, especially down the field. There's a chance that early in the season he is fantasy relevant because he can catch long touchdowns. That's what he's done literally the entire time. I don't know, probably the entire time he's been alive. And Matthew Stafford can definitely throw long touchdowns. So I'll say keep that in mind too. Then Tyler Hibby's a tight end. And yeah, he isn't this super high-end guy. He's not all that talented, but he definitely will do his job very well. He knows exactly how this offense works. He's going to be open when he's supposed to be open. He's going to catch a lot of stuff, do a lot of nice things, and there's a chance he's every bit as productive, again, fantasy-wise, as anyone you want to throw out there that's not, Kelsey, Kittle, Darren Waller, like those guys at the very top, because he's just going to get fairly consistent targets, and he has as much of a chance, again, to score touchdowns as a lot of these guys. So this offense, while there's a lot of stuff to be figured out here, because of that, there's a lot of opportunity for value because they have a chance to be really good, and no one's really sure where that production is going to go to. The Seahawks, on the other hand, I'm not quite as happy about, right? So you look at their offense, and the very first thing you have to talk about when you talk about the Seahawks offense is whether or not they have learned their lesson. They're actually going to be able to be smart about the way they do things. This team has been running the stupidest offense in the NFL for multiple years at this point. They almost fixed it at the beginning of last year, but then they got gun shy and they went right back to their old ways of grinding their nose into the pavement and going nowhere. New offensive coordinator, is he going to fix it? You sure hope so. And I think there's a real chance he does, but I'd be really careful with this team because that's not far from a guarantee. And if he doesn't, you're going to have assets that, while sound really good and were drafted pretty high, are going to suffer from the same level of inconsistency that they have for years because of the way Russell Wilson plays, combined with the way Pete Carroll decides his team has to run through a brick wall to get every first down. So fantasy-wise, Russell Wilson, again, as a fantasy asset himself, he's still going to throw a ton of touchdowns because he's incredibly good. That inconsistency shows up probably the most with him because of how this team will attack opposing defenses, or at least try to. And that's just hard for me to say at this point until I see that product on the field. So I'd be really careful with Russell Wilson, especially because even if their offense is a lot smarter, I don't know that their ceiling is that high, right? Because, and this is going to go back to the offensive line changes that they've made recently. Their offensive line is not built to be a modern, smart offensive scheme like the way that the Rams 49ers. If you switch their offensive lines, that'd be a disaster because these guys are a bunch of big, fat, kind of run blockers who struggle in space and struggle to do things that create offense easily up and down the field. And that would be really concerning if they do make that switch. And if they don't, then obviously they're still stuck in that same system. So I'm going to say be really careful with that. As far as though Lockett and Metcalf specifically go, my worry doesn't really extend to them. They're two guys who are super, super good in their own unique ways, who connect with Russell Wilson unbelievably well, and showed last year that even when the offense is stupid, they're going to be very productive. Now, they both obviously did have tougher ends of the year, and like I said, that did connect to how Pete Carroll reined everything in, but there was some other circumstances around that, and as well as the teams that they were going against ended up getting a lot better towards the end of the year defensively. So, yeah, the point is DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett are still both going to catch a ton of touchdowns. because of how good Russell Wilson is, and that means that no matter where you're drafting them, you're going to end up being fairly happy. Now, DK Metcalf is getting a bit high into the second round here, especially as a guy who I'm not even confident should lead the team in targets. But Tyler Lockett is a fifth rounder, like whatever. Again, I have my own personal problems with Tyler Lockett as a every down receiver, but as a fantasy player, that dude is going to be wildly productive and going to exceed that draft value, effectively guaranteed. At running back, Chris Carson, Rashad Penny. Chris Carson obviously is the main one you want to talk about. And as of now, he is still situated at the top of the depth chart, projected to get a lot more of the backfield share than a lot of guys across the league, and is a third-round pick for a reason, right? And he could probably justify that. He, however, has his own injury concerns. He does not catch the ball, generally, which is still something that can hurt him. And he's not a guy who has this big ceiling as far as rushing touchdowns especially goes, just because of the way the offense works, because it's so dependent on long stuff from Russell Wilson. It just doesn't really happen like that. So I will mention that with him. Rashad Penny, he is listed there back up right now. I don't think he's necessarily draftable, because even if Chris Carson goes down, I would imagine they would go to a big old committee at that point. Penny, while he is a little bit talented, is nothing special. So that's something to be careful of. But Gerald Everett, he's the one I really want to talk about here. Saving maybe the best for last with this video. Gerald Everett is a exceedingly talented player who is a very, very good borderline elite tight end in the NFL. And as I talked about my Seahawks preview a lot with him, he has a chance to fix the main thing that this offense struggles with, which is the ability to be consistently productive and to consistently create easy yards. That happens because of the way Russell Wilson plays. It happens because of the struggles of both their top two receivers in the initial parts of their route tree. And it happens because of the dumbass offense they play. Gerald Everett does, obviously he's not a coach, so he doesn't fix that one. But the other stuff, he has a real chance to fix because he actually gets open quickly. And Russell Wilson has shown that when he's given a tight end who does that, namely like Greg Olsen, he's willing to make those throws. And that's something I will just mention as far as fantasy-wise goes. I think there's a real chance that the Seahawks are smart that Gerald Everett almost leads this team in receptions. It's not a super likely scenario. In fact, I would say it's probably pretty unlikely, especially given the track record of this coaching staff. But that is something to keep in mind, and something, again, that I think you'd see early into the year. So when I'm talking about just not even bothering drafting a tight end, if you just rock in to week one with a kind of shot at Gerald Everett, there's a real chance it works out there, especially given the schedule where they play this soft cold zone first, where they're going to have to look for a lot more options than just chucking the ball deep, because the Colts are going to be too disciplined for that. So keep an eye out for that for sure. Overall, again, another kind of tough schedule, so be careful with a lot of these teams. But, that is the NFC West.